They called him a genius, a legend, a man immune to human weakness. But no one ever asked why Ethan Blake, one of the wealthiest CEOs in the country, hadn't let a single woman near him in 2 decades. Not one touch, not one hug, not even a handshake. Sounds strange? Good, because this emotional story is anything but ordinary. In a world obsessed with connection, Ethan chose the opposite. His rule was strict, and his reasons? Hidden. But when a new assistant walks into his life and breaks that rule with a single accidental touch, everything unravels. What starts as an awkward moment turns into a real story filled with tension, buried trauma, and something Ethan never expected to feel again: longing. This isn't your typical touching stories fairy tale. It's a battle between fear and desire, between what's safe and what's real. And as his fortress starts to crumble, you'll see that even the most guarded hearts have a breaking point, especially when the right person dares to knock. Unshakable precision. For 20 years, the billionaire CEO followed a silent oath: no physical contact with women. To some, it might have sounded absurd, even theatrical. But behind that rule lived an emotional scar, one so deep that even time feared touching it. People whispered stories about him, unsure of where the man ended and the myth began. The origin of Ethan's rule wasn't corporate, it was heartbreak, a betrayal in his youth, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but fractures your worldview, had carved a line he never dared cross again. Instead of healing, he built walls. Not metaphorical ones, but real behaviors. No handshakes, no hugs, not even an accidental brush in the elevator. The emotional story of his youth became a lifelong contract signed in silence. And like any fortress, his company became a reflection of its creator. Meeting rooms were structured to avoid proximity. Assistants trained not to hand him documents directly. His employees respected the boundary like sacred ground, some out of fear, others out of curiosity. Over time, even he started believing he was above the need for connection. Yet, deep down in the quiet of his penthouse, something kept asking, what if? It's easy to judge a man like Ethan from the outside. A touchless, unreachable billionaire might sound eccentric, maybe even arrogant. But if you've ever built emotional armor to survive a storm, you'd understand. Pain doesn't always announce itself. It shapes behaviors, warps trust, and sometimes becomes your identity. Ethan wasn't cold. He was just frozen in a moment he never escaped. There's something haunting about consistency. Ethan's life was perfect on paper: wealth, power, solitude. But perfection has a price, and his was paid in loneliness. Even his smiles were choreographed, his words filtered through control. People admired him, but no one knew him. And perhaps that was his greatest illusion, believing he could survive life without ever being touched again. He became a legend not because he wanted fame, but because mystery became his mask. The press painted him as a genius recluse, a man above the distractions of the world. But legends are lonely things. They echo, they don't feel. Somewhere along the way, Ethan forgot what real laughter sounded like when it wasn't rehearsed for shareholders. Forgotten, that is, until something or someone accidentally reached through. They say some rules aren't broken, they're interrupted. All it takes is the right moment, or the right person, to shake a foundation built over decades. And on a seemingly ordinary morning, when Lena Carter entered his office with nothing but good intentions and a warm presence, Ethan's world, so carefully calibrated, trembled for the very first time in 20 years. Confident but humble, sharp but kind, she stepped into Ethan's towering glass office with zero awareness of the invisible tripwire she was about to trigger. Her first day felt like any other to her, but to Ethan, it was the day everything shifted. Sometimes, life doesn't knock politely. It barges in with a smile and accidentally undoes your armor. It happened in the most innocent way. Ethan's tie was crooked, ironic for a man obsessed with control, and Lena, eager to make a good impression, reached out to help. Her fingers grazed the fabric, then his collarbone. Just that, 3 seconds of contact. But to Ethan, It was like setting off an alarm in a museum of glass memories. His reaction was sharp, almost instinctive, and it stunned them both. He pulled back, eyes wide, jaw clenched. The room felt suddenly heavier, like air thickened with unspoken history. Lena stood there, blinking, unsure if she'd crossed a line or simply fixed a tie. She wasn't afraid, just puzzled. And that confusion was the beginning of her curiosity, a curiosity that would soon awaken something dormant inside him. Ethan left the room shortly after, retreating under the weight of emotions he hadn't felt in decades. That touch, though brief, wasn't just a mistake, it was a rupture. His fortress had a crack, and the breeze from it was more terrifying than any corporate scandal. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head like a haunting melody. And the worst part? A piece of him didn't want to forget it. Lena, on the other hand, went about her day unaware of the emotional earthquake she'd caused. Her presence in the office was like spring arriving after a long, bitter winter. She laughed with others, asked questions with genuine interest, and made the space warmer just by existing in it. To her, Ethan was a respected boss with peculiar habits. To him, she was the spark he never saw coming. People like Ethan spend their lives dodging fate. But fate has a funny way of finding you in the most casual interactions. A touch, a word, a glance, tiny moments with big consequences. Lena hadn't meant to challenge him, yet she already had. And without even trying, she'd stepped into a real story that was still being written, one Ethan never intended to tell again. What neither of them knew yet was that the emotional story they had unknowingly started wouldn't stay small. Because sometimes the most touching stories don't begin with fireworks. They begin with the softest touch and a silence that suddenly feels loud. Certainly not of his emotions. But after Lena arrived, the cracks in his once untouchable self grew wider each day. Her laughter echoed through the corridors like light spilling into a room that had been dark too long. He caught himself listening for her voice, searching for her face during meetings. And worst of all, he couldn't stop wondering if she'd touch him again. He started building new walls, only this time they were visible. New memos, stricter protocols, cold stares that once kept people at bay. But Lena, she didn't flinch. She responded with kindness, wit, and that maddeningly calm energy that somehow always softened the edges of the room. The harder he tried to distance himself, the closer she seemed to get, not physically, but emotionally. And Ethan was starting to forget how to push her away. Some people slip under your skin not through force, but through presence. Lena didn't try to fix Ethan. She didn't ask too many questions, but she saw him. And for a man who'd lived in a fortress of avoidance for 2 decades, being seen was far more intimate than being touched. That's what scared him the most, because the story he'd buried long ago was slowly being read aloud again. He began noticing everything about her, how she twisted her pen when she was thinking, the way she greeted the janitor like a friend, her occasional clumsy moments like spilling coffee on reports and apologizing with a scrunched-up face that made him want to smile. And he did once or twice. But instead of leaning in, Ethan recoiled. Affection, to him, still felt like a threat disguised as comfort. The battle inside him was relentless. Logic told him to shut it down, to fire her, to end the distraction. But his heart, it had other plans. Every time she knocked on his door, something inside him hoped it would stay open just a little longer. And in those moments, when she'd linger after meetings or ask if he was okay, he'd feel both terrified and alive. It's hard to admit when someone gets under your skin, especially when you've prided yourself on being untouchable. But Lena had started something he couldn't control, a real story where his emotions weren't just passengers but the ones driving. He wanted to believe he was imagining it, that this wasn't happening. But the truth? It was. And that truth was beginning to unravel him. Some wars are fought in silence. Glances exchanged like hidden letters, moments stretched longer than they should be. Ethan was fighting for distance, but his heart, it was already moving closer and fast. And as Lena continued being her natural, disarming self, one question lingered like perfume in the air. What happens when the wall finally breaks? And he'd convinced himself he didn't. But when he saw Lena laughing with Daniel from accounting, something burned deep in his chest. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a flare of emotion so primal, so uninvited, that he clenched his fist before realizing it. She wasn't his. Yet, the idea of someone else making her smile felt like betrayal. He tried to rationalize it. She's just friendly, he told himself. This is nothing. But his body betrayed him. Stiff shoulders, dry throat, that sharp glance he gave Daniel without meaning to. He began micromanaging her schedule, inventing excuses to keep her in his orbit. All subtle moves, masked under professionalism. But Lena noticed, and she wasn't the kind of woman who ignored tension. At a rooftop charity event, under soft lights and city stars, things came to a head. Lena was radiant, dressed in a simple navy dress that somehow made breathing feel like a chore for Ethan. He watched her from distance, talking with guests, smiling too easily. When she finally approached him, his words came out clipped sharp. "You're very social tonight," he said. She raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Should I not be?" she asked, tone calm but challenging. Ethan didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, so tight it nearly snapped. And then, in a moment that felt like both surrender and defiance, he pulled her close and kissed her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't polite. It was raw, driven by every feeling he'd been running from. For one beautiful second, the world disappeared. But just as fast as he leaned in, he pulled away. The emotional story that had just taken a new turn now hit a wall of panic. "That was a mistake," he muttered, stepping back as if burned. Lena stared at him, shocked but not hurt. Instead, she stood tall and replied, "No, the mistake is pretending it didn't mean something." Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't plead. And that strength shook him more than the kiss. She wasn't going to chase him. She wasn't going to apologize for feeling something real. Lena had just proven that vulnerability didn't mean weakness. It meant courage. And Ethan, who had built his life avoiding emotional exposure, had just met someone who wouldn't let him hide behind silence. The man who controlled boardrooms was suddenly powerless in front of a woman who simply told the truth. The kiss changed everything, but so did her refusal to play along with his fear. She didn't storm off. She didn't beg. She waited, calm, honest, present. And in her quiet confidence, Ethan saw something terrifying, the reflection of everything he'd been missing. But fear doesn't vanish in a single night. Sometimes it grows louder before it finally lets go. In control, silenced the storm she'd stirred inside him. But the silence was unbearable. Her absence echoed louder than her presence ever did, like missing a melody after it's already been stuck in your head. He found himself checking his phone, wandering past her desk, listening for footsteps that never came. At first, he called it curiosity, then concern. But by the end of the week, it was clear he missed her. Not just her efficiency or professionalism. Her. The way she saw through him, the way she brought life into cold rooms, the way she'd look at him like he wasn't broken. And that longing, so foreign, so overwhelming, finally cracked the foundation of his restraint. He ran into her by chance, or maybe fate was done waiting. It was at a quiet bar, low light and even lower expectations. She was with friends, relaxed, laughing in a way that made him feel both warm and exiled. When their eyes met, it was like gravity had a new command. She walked over slowly, no games, no guards. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, voice steady but soft. They talked. No filters, no roles. Just Ethan and Lena, two people stuck between fear and desire. And then, with no hesitation, he kissed her again. This time it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, slow and deliberate, like a man who finally realized what it meant to feel alive again. She didn't pull away. She didn't ask questions. She just kissed him back, as if she'd been waiting all along. The emotional story that had once felt impossible was now unfolding in real time. Ethan felt like a dam had burst inside him. 20 years of isolation washing away in a single moment of honesty. He didn't want to hide anymore. Not from her, not from himself. For the first time, he was choosing vulnerability over safety. And strangely, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like freedom. He wasn't healed. Not yet. But healing had begun. And Lena was the reason. She hadn't saved him. She'd awakened him. Reminded him that human connection wasn't the enemy. It was the point. And now, each moment with her felt like proof that even the most reclusive hearts still crave warmth. Even the untouchable eventually reach out. Ethan Blake, the man who once feared a touch more than failure, now couldn't imagine a world where he didn't feel hers. The rule that had defined his life had finally shattered, not with force, but with grace. And as he looked in her eyes that night, a new rule quietly took its place. Never let go of what makes you feel whole, uttered with a single touch. Have you ever pushed someone away, only to realize they were the very thing your soul was begging for? Or maybe you've been that person, the one who dared to love someone closed off to the world. This emotional story wasn't just about Ethan and Lena. It was about us, about how real stories often begin where comfort ends. What do you think? Can love truly melt 20 years of silence? Or are some people just meant to be alone? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what this story made you feel. And hey, if you want to keep discovering stories that hit deeper than fiction, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's a lot more coming your way.